Imagine a place so massive, so untouched, that early explorers believed it wasn't just another territory, but the edge of the world itself. A land where mountains erupt out of the ocean like ancient giants, where glaciers carve deep scars through the earth, and where storms move with the power of legends. This place would eventually be called Alaska, the Great Land. And long before it became a political bargaining chip or a deal sealed in secrecy, it was a frontier of awe, danger, and unimaginable potential. But here's the twist. For centuries, Russia barely remembered it existed. Our story begins long before anyone spoke about selling anything. It begins with the people who lived there first: the Alus, the Yupik, the Inupiat communities, shaped by the brutal beauty around them. They hunted sea lions across icy waters, fished salmon from rushing rivers, and moved with the rhythm of the land. Their world was a living engine of survival, one that Europe had never even imagined. And then, somewhere in the 17th century, a rumor started spreading across the Russian Empire. A whisper, a possibility, a distant coastline far beyond Siberia, beyond the storms, beyond the freezing void of the Bering Sea. Few believed it existed. Even fewer dared to seek it. But explorers aren't built like few. They chase the impossible. The first European eyes that ever caught a glimpse of Alaskan shores belonged not to a famous hero or a celebrated captain, but to the crew of an exhausted Siberian expedition led by Semyon Desnyov in 1648. They weren't looking for new lands. They were just trying to survive an impossible journey. Yet through the fog, through the spray of the freezing waters, they saw at the shadow of a coastline that wasn't supposed to exist. They never landed. They didn't map it. They didn't even understand what they had found. But they had sparked something. Decades later, Russia would awaken to the idea of a frontier stretching beyond imagination. A place untouched by the empires of Europe, a place rich with resources no one had yet counted. A place that might just rewrite the future of the empire if someone could reach it. And this is where the story shifts from myth to mission. Under Tsar Peter the Great, curiosity became law. He ordered the exploration of the Pacific, determined to uncover what lay beyond Siberia's frozen edge. That decision would set off a chain of events leading to one of the greatest geopolitical stories in history, a story of ambition, neglect, greed, opportunity, and ultimately a sale that still sparks controversy today. But before the politics, before the gold, before the betrayal and the legends, there was simply this: a giant, untouched world waiting in silence. Alaska was not discovered. It was noticed. And once noticed, it would never again be forgotten. The glimpse of Alaska seen by Desnyov's crew could become another forgotten rumor, like a sailor's tale told at night to impress young recruits. But history has a strange rule. Once a mystery is noticed, someone will try to solve it. And in Russia, that someone was the empire itself. Decades after Desnyov's accidental discovery, the world was changing fast. Empires were racing to map the last blank spaces on the globe. Whoever controlled the oceans controlled the future. And somewhere in the mind of Peter the Great, a thought took root. What lies beyond the edge of Siberia? Peter wasn't a man who liked blank spaces on maps. To him, a blank map was an opportunity for a threat. And threats had to be investigated. So he launched one of the most ambitious exploration missions in Russian history. The Kamchatka expeditions led by a Danish-born naval officer, Vitus Bering. Bering wasn't a swashbuckling adventurer. He was disciplined, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who didn't chase glory but completed missions. Maybe that's why Peter trusted him. Maybe that's why Bering's name would one day define an entire sea and a strait. The journey was brutal before it even began. Imagine hauling ship timber, iron, tools, food, and crew across the entire width of Russia with no railways, no proper roads, nothing but raw wilderness. It took years to prepare. But in 1728, Bering finally sailed into the unknown. And what he found was nothing. Nothing but fog, wind, ice, and waves that threatened to swallow his fragile vessel whole. He sailed through the strait that now bears his name, but clouds rolled over the horizon like a curtain, hiding North America completely. He passed within sight of Alaska yet never saw it. To many, that would have been a failure. To Russia, it was motivation. The empire sent him again, this time with a larger expedition of hundreds of men, scientists, carpenters, hunters, priests, even artists. This was no simple voyage. It was a floating city, a scientific army, a moving laboratory of ambition. In 1741, they finally approached land. Through the clearing mist, mountains rose like dark teeth above the sea. Snowfields glowed in the pale summer light. The coastline was sharp, wild, and untouched, nothing like the familiar shores of the old world. This time, Russians didn't just observe. They stepped onto the land. These explorers weren't thinking about politics or empire. They weren't imagining one day losing or selling anything. They were simply overwhelmed by the scale of what they had found. A new world, raw and brutal, but filled with promise. The mystery was gone. Alaska was no longer a rumor. It was real, and Russia knew it. One landing created a chain reaction. More expeditions followed. More explorers came. Reports spread across the empire like wildfire. Endless forests, towering mountains, oceans full of life, and a coastline stretching farther than anyone could have imagined. The great land was no longer the edge of the world. It was the beginning of a new chapter. But discovery is one thing. Claiming, settling, and profiting from it, that was an entirely different battle. And Russia, hungry for opportunity, was ready to take that battle head-on. By the early 1730s, the mystery was no longer whether Alaska existed. The question became, what will Russia do with it? And in 1732, the answer arrived on the deck of a small but determined ship named St. Gabriel. This wasn't a grand imperial fleet or a glorious military expedition. There were no parades, no fanfare, no diplomats. Just a handful of sailors, officers, and explorers battling the cold winds of the Bering Sea, driven by something stronger than comfort. The hunger to uncover new frontiers. The St. Gabriel, commanded by Mikhail Gvozdev, was built for endurance, not elegance. Its wooden hull creaked like old bones as it pushed through the icy waters. Every rope was stiff with frost. Every wave was a reminder that the Pacific does not forgive mistakes. But the crew pressed on because somewhere ahead was a land no European had ever truly set foot on. Then, one morning, through the gray haze of the northern fog, the rugged coastline of Alaska appeared. Dark cliffs, wine-bent pines, wild, unclaimed land stretching farther than the eye could see. This was not the warm, fertile paradise explorers dreamed of. This was harsher, colder, and infinitely more majestic. And yet it called to them. When Russian boots touched Alaskan soil for the first time, there was no dramatic flag raising, no triumphant speeches. The moment was quiet, almost humble. Gvozdev's men walked onto the rocky shore, listening to the crash of waves and the cries of distant seabirds. They made notes, surveyed the coastline, recorded the latitude, and in doing so, pulled Alaska out of myth and into the world of empire. What they didn't fully realize was that this simple landing would ignite a chain of events that changed history. Their arrival opened the door for future expeditions of traders, hunters, priests, adventurers, each one carrying the empire further into this new world. Word spread back to Russia. The land was rich, the coastline long, and the resources plentiful. Fur, fish, timber, opportunities beyond imagination. But the explorers also understood something else. Alaska was not empty. Local Aleut and Eskimo communities lived across the islands and coasts, hunting sea mammals and navigating the waters with skill developed over centuries. To them, this land was not a discovery, it was home. They watched the newcomers with curiosity, caution, and quiet calculation. This subtle, silent moment, the meeting of worlds, would shape the future of the entire region. From the rocky shorelines of the Aleutian chain, the Russian Empire saw more than a landscape. It saw potential, expansion, wealth, and yes, power. The St. Gabriel stayed only long enough to confirm what explorers before had only guessed. Then it turned back towards Siberia, its sails filled with cold wind, carrying a message that would echo across the empire. There is a new land, and it can be ours. With that, the race to claim, settle, and dominate Alaska began. But discovery was the easy part. What came next? Building a colony at the edge of the world would test Russia in ways no one expected. When the St. Gabriel returned with news of a real, mapped, reachable Alaska, the Russian Empire did what every ambitious power eventually does. It turned discovery into business. And on the edges of the Pacific, a new empire began to rise, not through armies or conquests, but through fur. Because in the 18th century, fur was oil. It was wealth, influence, luxury, and status wrapped into one. And Alaska had more of it than almost anywhere else on Earth. Soon, daring Siberian traders of Promishlenikia began sailing east in search of opportunity. These weren't noble officers or imperial courtiers. They were risk-takers, hunters, adventurers, men who gambled everything on the promise of the great land. And as they returned with ships overflowing with pelts, Russia realized something shocking. Alaska could be insanely profitable. But wild profit comes with wild chaos. Different traders fought for territory, undercut prices, disrupted relations with local tribes, and nearly started wars over hunting grounds. If Russia wanted order and wanted to keep the money flowing, it needed control. So in 1799, the empire created something extraordinary. The Russian-American Company. A monopoly. A corporation. A state-backed engine of expansion. This wasn't just a business. It was a government with a logo. It could build settlements, run courts, create trade networks, even maintain its own fleet. Think of it as Russia's version of the British East India Company outset in frozen, storm-bitten lands at the edge of the world. And at its helm stood two titans. Gregory Shelikov, ambitious, relentless, obsessed with the Pacific frontier. Alexander Baranov-Matov, charismatic, and stubborn enough to survive anything Alaska threw at him. Shelikov had the vision. Baranov made it real. Under their leadership, Russian settlements grew across the coastline like small sparks of civilization in a sea of wilderness. Wooden fortresses, Orthodox chapels, warehouses, shipyards, even schools. Russian and Aleut families lived side by side. Native communities traded furs for tools, metal, and goods they had never seen before. And for a moment, it looked like a thriving miniature empire was forming far from home. Trade routes exploded with activity. From Alaska to Siberia, from Siberia to St. Petersburg, from Alaska down to California, where Russians built Fort Ross and traded everything from fish to ice. Yes, ice. Huge blocks carved from frozen lakes were shipped south to cool American food stores and restaurants. Alaska wasn't just a wilderness anymore. It was becoming a global player. But beneath the prosperity, cracks began to show. Running colonies thousands of miles away wasn't easy. Supplies often arrived late. Winters were brutal beyond imagination. Conflicts with local tribes flared. And managing all of this required more than adventurous hunters. It required skilled administrators, diplomats, planners. Instead, the company was often forced to rely on whoever could survive the journey. Still, for decades, the Russian-American Company thrived. It became the beating heart of Russian Alaska, a reason settlements existed at all. And as long as furs kept flowing, everyone believed the empire at the edge of the world was unstoppable. But nature had its own plans. A silent disaster was already brewing, one that would strike at the company's foundation and send the entire colonial project into decline. The fortune of Russian America was built on a single animal. And when that animal began to disappear, everything else would crumble with it. By the early 1800s, Russian Alaska was no longer a lonely outpost lost in the northern fog. It had become something far bigger, a network of settlements, trade routes, and ambitions stretching thousands of kilometers across the Pacific. But as Alaska grew, so did its hunger. The colonies needed supplies. Food, grain, tools, livestock, things the frozen northern frontier simply could not produce. And so the Russian-American Company looked south, far south, to a land of sunshine, fertile soil, and opportunity. A land already attracting settlers from Mexico, Spain, and the young United States. A land that would one day be called California. In 1812, under the leadership of Ivan Kuskov, Russia made a move that stunned everyone. They founded Fort Ross, a wooden fortress perched on the rugged cliffs north of San Francisco. Imagine the scene. A cold Pacific wind sweeping over rolling hills. Waves smashing against dark rocks. And rising above it all to Russian palisade, Orthodox chapel, cannons facing the sea, and settlers dressed in heavy coats walking under the California sun. It looked like a small piece of Siberia had been dropped onto a postcard of California. But Fort Ross wasn't built for glory. It was built for survival. The idea was simple. Grow crops, ship them to Alaska, keep the colonies alive. Wheat, vegetables, cattle, everything that Alaska lacked, California could provide. And it worked. For a while, Fort Ross became the lifeline of Russian America. But something unexpected happened. Russians didn't arrive alone. They came with Aleut, native hunters from Alaska skilled in navigating the Pacific. Together they created a community unlike any other on the continent. Russians, Aleut, Californios, and local tribes living side by side, trading, intermarrying, sharing traditions. This strange multicultural settlement became a curiosity to American traders and Spanish governors. Who were these people? Why had Russians suddenly appeared on their doorstep? Whispers spread. Is Russia planning to colonize California? Will Alaska expand all the way down the coast? Are they after the Pacific? The truth was far less dramatic, but the timing was terrible. While Russians dreamed of farms and grain, the world around them was changing. California was becoming more crowded. American settlers were moving west. The Spanish authority was weakening. The political landscape was a powder keg, and Russia was a guest no one wanted to stay too long. Meanwhile, the Russian-American company faced another problem. Fort Ross wasn't producing enough food. The soil was stubborn, supplies inconsistent, harvests unpredictable, and the costs enormous. Ships, tools, labor, defenses, all of it weighing heavily on a colony already stretched thin across thousands of kilometers. But the biggest blow was still to come. Just as Fort Ross was finding its place, the company discovered something critical. California offered opportunity, but Alaska needed attention. And the empire couldn't properly manage both. Slowly, reluctantly, Russia accepted the truth. Fort Ross was a dream too far from home, too expensive to maintain, and too vulnerable to the political storms gathering in North America. In 1841, the decision was made. Fort Ross was sold. The southernmost Russian colony vanished from the map. But its legacy remained a strange, beautiful chapter in the story of Russian America. A moment when Russia reached beyond frost and darkness to plant a foothold under a sun that was never truly theirs. And as Fort Ross faded into history, the colonies in Alaska found themselves standing alone again, more vulnerable than ever. Because the company's greatest challenge, the one that would shake the very foundation of the Northern Empire, was still ahead. For decades, the Russian presence in Alaska had grown like a stubborn flame in a world of ice. Settlements multiplied, trade routes expanded, ships traveled back and forth between continents. It looked, on the surface, as if Russian America was finally stabilizing. But beneath that fragile calm, pressure was building quietly, steadily, dangerously. And it all began with gold. Not Russian gold, American gold. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, tens of thousands of fortune hunters, Americans, Europeans, adventurers from every corner of the world flooded the Pacific coast. And once the fever took hold, it spread north like wildfire. The moment rumors surfaced about possible gold deposits in Alaska, American prospectors began arriving, and they did not ask for permission. Russian settlers watched from their wooden fortresses as groups of armed strangers moved through their territory, searching rivers and mountains for fortune. They weren't enemies, not officially. But they weren't allies either. They were a warning. America was coming. Meanwhile, Russia faced problems inside the colonies as well. The fur trade, the empire's lifeline, was becoming unstable. Sea otters, hunted ruthlessly for decades, were disappearing. Entire hunting grounds once rich with wildlife were now empty and silent. Without fur, the Russian-American company began to wobble. Its profits dwindled. Its supply chains faltered. Settlements that once thrived found themselves struggling to survive. And as if that wasn't enough, another tension simmered beneath the surface, a tension between Russians and the indigenous peoples of Alaska. For years, the relationship had been a delicate balance of trade, cooperation, and occasional conflict. But as resources dwindled and outsiders arrived, the balance broke. Tribes who had once traded willingly now saw Russians as competitors, even intruders. Disputes over hunting grounds turned into standoffs. Misunderstandings escalated into confrontations. No grand battles took place. No declarations of war were written. But the frontier felt hotter, sharper, more unpredictable than ever before. And then came the final ingredient in this growing storm: hunger. In the 1850s, Russia struggled to feed its Alaskan settlements. Weather patterns shifted. Supply ships were delayed. The closure of Fort Ross cut off a reliable food source. Colonists who once lived comfortably now faced shortages, rationing, and long winters with too little to survive on. Even the native communities, long masters of their environment, suffered as sea otters vanished and ecosystem rhythms collapsed. Everyone was feeling the pressure. Everyone was desperate. And desperation leads to conflict. Some tribes united into larger alliances for the first time in generations, determined to defend their land and resources. Russian outposts suddenly found themselves surrounded not by small hunting parties, but by organized groups demanding respect, fairness, or departure. Rumors spread among settlers. They're gathering warriors. They outnumber us. They have American rifles now. Fear settled over the colonies like a second winter. Russia faced a truth it had tried to ignore. Alaska was too far, too costly, and too dangerous to maintain alone. Across the ocean, the American presence was growing. Their ships arrived faster. Their traders offered better deals. Their prospectors ignored Russian authority entirely. And behind them stood a rising nation with resources, ambition, and a doctrine that warned Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Russian America was turning from a dream into a liability. The frontier was changing and the empire felt it slipping away. The stage was set. Tension had peaked. And the next chapter would bring the final blow that pushed Russia toward a decision no one expected. The decision to sell Alaska. For decades, the Russian presence in Alaska had grown like a stubborn flame in a world of ice. Settlements multiplied, trade routes expanded, ships traveled back and forth between continents. It looked, on the surface, as if Russian America was finally stabilizing. But beneath that fragile calm, pressure was building quietly, steadily, dangerously. And it all began with gold. Not Russian gold. American gold. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, tens of thousands of fortune hunters, Americans, Europeans, adventurers from every corner of the world flooded the Pacific coast. And once the fever took hold, it spread north like wildfire. The moment rumors surfaced about possible gold deposits in Alaska, American prospectors began arriving, and they did not ask for permission. Russian settlers watched from their wooden fortresses as groups of armed strangers moved through their territory, searching rivers and mountains for fortune. They weren't enemies, not officially. But they weren't allies either. They were a warning. America was coming. Meanwhile, Russia faced problems inside the colonies as well. The fur trade, the empire's lifeline, was becoming unstable. Sea otters, hunted ruthlessly for decades, were disappearing. Entire hunting grounds once rich with wildlife were now empty and silent. Without fur, the Russian-American company began to wobble. Its profits dwindled. Its supply chains faltered. Settlements that once thrived found themselves struggling to survive. And as if that wasn't enough, another tension simmered beneath the surface, a tension between Russians and the indigenous peoples of Alaska. For years, the relationship had been a delicate balance of trade, cooperation, and occasional conflict. But as resources dwindled and outsiders arrived, the balance broke. Tribes who had once traded willingly now saw Russians as competitors, even intruders. Disputes over hunting grounds turned into standoffs. Misunderstandings escalated into confrontations. No grand battles took place. No declarations of war were written. But the frontier felt hotter, sharper, more unpredictable than ever before. And then came the final ingredient in this growing storm: hunger. In the 1850s, Russia struggled to feed its Alaskan settlements. Weather patterns shifted. Supply ships were delayed. The closure of Fort Ross cut off a reliable food source. Colonists who once lived comfortably now faced shortages, rationing, and long winters with too little to survive on. Even the native communities, long masters of their environment, suffered as sea otters vanished and ecosystem rhythms collapsed. Everyone was feeling the pressure. Everyone was desperate. And desperation leads to conflict. Some tribes united into larger alliances for the first time in generations, determined to defend their land and resources. Russian outposts suddenly found themselves surrounded not by small hunting parties, but by organized groups demanding respect, fairness, or departure. Rumors spread among settlers. They're gathering warriors. They outnumber us. They have American rifles now. Fear settled over the colonies like a second winter. Russia faced a truth it had tried to ignore. Alaska was too far, too costly, and too dangerous to maintain alone. Across the ocean, the American presence was growing. Their ships arrived faster. Their traders offered better deals. Their prospectors ignored Russian authority entirely. And behind them stood a rising nation with resources, ambition, and a doctrine that warned Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Russian America was turning from a dream into a liability. The frontier was changing and the empire felt it slipping away. The stage was set. Tension had peaked. And the next chapter would bring the final blow that pushed Russia toward a decision no one expected. The decision to sell Alaska. By the mid-19th century, the signs were impossible to ignore. Alaska, once Russia's proud frontier, had become a ticking time bomb. Not because of nature. Not because of the collapsing fur trade. But because of a new force rising rapidly just across the Pacific coast. The United States of America. At the start of the century, the U.S. was still a young nation and sure of its place in the world. But by the 1850s, everything changed. America was expanding west at breakneck speed, absorbing new territories, swallowing frontiers, and fueling a national belief that the continent itself was meant for them. They called it manifest destiny, a doctrine that said, "This land is ours, all of it." And for Russia, watching from across the Bering Sea, the warning was clear. America had bought Louisiana from France. It had taken Texas from Mexico. It was pushing toward California, Oregon, the Pacific, and Alaska. Alaska sat right above their growing empire like a ripe, forgotten prize. Russian officials knew what that meant. A conflict was coming, sooner or later. And Russia was exhausted. The Crimean War had slammed the empire into the ground, draining the treasury, shaking political confidence, and exposing how outdated its military really was. The empire needed money. It needed allies. It needed stability. What it didn't need was a distant, starving colony vulnerable to American expansion. Count Muraviev-Amursky, Russia's governor of eastern Siberia, saw the danger first. He wrote to the Tsar, warning bluntly, "We cannot defend Alaska. If America wants it, they will take it. Better to leave it on our own terms." It wasn't fear, it was logic. To defend Alaska from the U.S., Russia would have to send ships across half the planet. Reinforcements would take months. Supplies even longer. And if war broke out, one American ship could destroy an entire outpost before Russia even received the message. The empire simply couldn't hold it. Worse, American settlers were already moving north, crossing into Alaskan rivers, exploring forests, searching for gold. They weren't invading, not officially, but they were testing the frontier, testing how far they could go before someone stopped them. Russia saw everything, and it had neither the money nor the strength to respond. Meanwhile, the Russian-American company, the empire's colonial machine, was falling apart from within. Mismanagement, shortages, empty hunting grounds. The once proud symbol of Russian ambition now looked like a sinking ship dragging the empire with it. And in the center of this storm stood Tsar Alexander I. He needed funds to modernize the military. He needed allies against Britain. He needed to avoid another humiliating disaster. America, on the other hand, seemed unusually friendly. They remembered something important. Russia had supported the Union during the U.S. Civil War. In their minds, Russia was a quiet, reliable partner, not a threat. And for Russia, the United States suddenly looked less like a rival and more like an opportunity. One that might solve a problem the empire could no longer ignore. The whispers began in palace corridors. Should we hold Alaska? Should we abandon it? Should we sell it before someone takes it? It was a radical idea, almost unthinkable. Selling an entire territory. Selling a piece of the empire. But as advisors, ministers, and generals weighed the odds, one truth kept returning to the table. Alaska would be lost either with compensation or without it. And if Russia was going to let go of the great land, it needed to let go strategically, with a plan, with dignity, and with a partner powerful enough to keep Britain in check. That partner was America. The stage was set. Russia was weak. America was rising. The frontier was slipping away. And in the next chapter, the empire would make a decision no one expected, to a decision still debated, mythologized, and misunderstood to this day. Russia would sell Alaska. The year is 1867. In the dim, lamplit corridors of Washington and St. Petersburg, a quiet game of diplomacy unfolds, one that will rewrite the map of the world. While newspapers chatter about reconstruction after the Civil War, a handful of men are preparing one of the boldest geopolitical transactions of the 19th century: the sale of Alaska. On the Russian side stands Edward D. Stokel, a sharp, charismatic diplomat who knows American politics better than many Americans themselves. Across the table sits his key counterpart, U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward, a man whose ambition is matched only by his belief that America's destiny lies in expansion. But neither man can act openly. The order from the throne of the Russian Empire is clear: sell Alaska quickly, quietly, and without igniting public outrage. Economic pressure and fear of future conflict with the growing United States make secrecy essential. If the British catch wind of the plan, the situation could collapse instantly. So Stokel works in shadows, visiting senators privately, smoothing political resistance, and yes, discreetly encouraging key figures with generous gifts. At the same time, he pushes American newspapers to portray Alaska not as a frozen wasteland, but as a land of hidden riches, timber, fish, minerals, and opportunity too great to ignore. Meanwhile, in the American capital, Seward plays a delicate internal game. President Andrew Johnson faces criticism and political enemies eager to block any initiative he supports. Many senators scoff at the idea of buying a giant icebox full of seals, as one paper mocks. But Seward persists. He sees farther toward a future where the United States dominates the Pacific. Night after night, drafts of the agreement slide across polished desks. Maps are unrolled. Borders are argued. Numbers whispered. Finally, after weeks of tense negotiation, Stokel pushes for a higher price, a $7.2 million. Seward, sensing momentum, agrees before opposition can regroup. On March 30, 1867, just after 4 o'clock in the morning, the treaty is signed. There are no crowds, no speeches, no triumphant military marches. Just the scratch of pens and the sound of wax seals being pressed into warm parchment. Yet that quiet moment marks the turning point not only for Alaska but for both empires. In Russia, the deal is kept under strict secrecy. In America, the press erupts in controversy. But the ink is dry. The land is sold. And history has already begun to shift. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden corners of history, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. It really helps us bring more stories like this to life. October 18, 1867. A cold wind sweeps across the settlement of Sitka, once the proud capital of Russian America, now preparing for a moment that feels both unreal and inevitable. Russian soldiers in dark uniforms line up on one side of the square. Opposite them, newly arrived American troops wait in silence. Between the two groups stands a tall wooden flagpole. At 3:30 p.m., the ceremony begins. The Russian flag starts to descend, but suddenly, it catches on the ropes. It twists, clings to the mast, and refuses to fall. Onlookers whisper. Some later swear the wind held it there as if Alaska itself didn't want to leave. A sailor climbs the pole to free it, but as he tugs the cloth loose, he slips. The flag tumbles down and lands on Russian bayonets, an accident soon transformed into legend. Moments later, the American flag rises. Slowly, unsteadily. Even it struggles, snagging on the lines until a sudden gust of wind finally lifts the stars and stripes into the gray Alaskan sky. And just like that, after 126 years under the double-headed eagle of the Russian Empire, Alaska becomes part of the United States. But while the ceremony is calm, the reaction back home is anything but. In Russia, newspapers erupt. A shameful loss. A national humiliation. A territory sold in secret. Editors call it a betrayal of the explorers and settlers who built lives on that distant coast. And when people learn the sale price, a $7.2 million, anger only grows. Rumors fill the vacuum left by secrecy. The Americans never paid. The gold sank on the way to Russia. Alaska wasn't sold but leased for 99 years. None of it is true, yet the myths thrive for generations. Meanwhile, in America, the deal is mocked as Seward's folly. Critics joke that the United States bought nothing but ice, polar bears, and empty mountains. Even the Senate approval barely passes. But history has a sense of irony. Within years, gold is discovered, then copper, then vast reserves of oil. What many called a foolish purchase becomes one of the most profitable acquisitions in world history. Back in Russia, the consequences are quieter but significant. The money from the sale helps fund key railroad small steps that will later shape the industrial future of the empire. And although most Russian settlers return home, a few dozen remain in Alaska, becoming the ancestors of small but proud Russian-Alaskan communities that still exist today. Yet the biggest legacy of the sale is philosophical. It reminds us that history is not a straight line, it is a chain of decisions made in uncertainty. In 1867, Alaska looked like a frozen burden on the edge of the world. No one could have known what the next century would bring. And that's why stories like this matter. They show how choices made in silence, in distant rooms, can echo across continents and centuries. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of the most misunderstood episodes of history, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories the world has forgotten. And see you in the next episode.